Hello everyone. Today's case is yet another layer to the Edmonton Killing Fields content that I've been covering, and I ended up finding today's case after researching for that case. In 2005, a group of teenagers and an adult man would end up teaming up and killing not only a woman, but a 13-year-old girl. And this is a sick one that definitely needs to be talked about. So be prepared. Nina Courtepatte was born on October 3rd of 1991 in Edmonton, Alberta. She had long, thick, dark hair and was said to be a very happy baby that brought so much joy to the family, being one of 6 siblings. Her mother Peach sang that as a baby, Nina would always be exploring and was always chewing on everything in sight. As she grew up, Nina would attend Aboriginal Head Start, an early childhood development program for Aboriginal children and their families. And even as a child, Nina seemed to be extremely headstrong. There were so many stories about her not being afraid to speak her mind, such as the time that she participated in a DARE program and then afterwards she reprimanded someone for smoking near a no smoking sign. Or how if she felt like a teacher made a mistake, she would stand up and not sit down until the teacher acknowledged that mistake. She would even go to classmates who were being bullied and tell them how beautiful they actually were and how much strength they had. And she loved her family and her siblings. She had a younger brother and a younger sister, and she was very protective of them. She loved telling them stories and playing dress up with them, doing their makeup. And she also had a really close relationship with her older brother Patrick, who is someone that she felt she could confide anything to. Essentially, Nina was just a beautiful young girl who was extremely compassionate, which makes her fate even that much harder to hear and accept. However, around the time that Nina was around 8 years old, she started to act out in some very odd ways. She started hiding outside after dark to scare her mother, and her behavior even escalated to a point where she was telling people that she was being abused at home and CPS had to get involved. However, CPS investigated, and I'm sure the siblings would have corroborated and, everyone in the family, and you always want to trust someone when they're saying that there's something wrong. But it seems in this case, it was just Nina for some reason acting out. After this, the family ended up moving to the west side of Edmonton, and once they made that move, Nina was happy again and all of her behavioral issues went away. So maybe something was just happening at that school she was attending or that area with friends or something. But once they made the move, she was happier and life seemed okay again. As Nina grew into a young teen, she was a beautiful young girl who was known to love music, dancing, movies. She had a talent for drawing and writing, and she dreamed of being a model or an actress when she grew up. And it wasn't just a far-fetched dream, because Nina actually won a modeling contest in 2004, and she would frequently perform in plays at the Boys and Girls Club of Edmonton. On the weekends, she would cook breakfast for the family, and she really loved it. She would make pancakes and eggs, and she had a very strong bond with her mother, who was teaching her Korea at that time. After hearing all of that, I'm sure you wouldn't be surprised to hear that Nina was a very popular girl, and she was very social, and she seemed to make friends very fast. But as many teens do, Nina was starting to grow into her own, and she was starting to challenge the rules quite a bit. One rule that Nina's mother had was that Nina always had to call and come home when she was supposed to, and things were fine until they weren't. On March 30th of 2005, Nina would ask her mother if she could spend the weekend at her friend's house. And this friend was actually her best friend that she'd known for years and years. And this was 15-year-old KB. She only goes by KB in the documents, so we're going to be calling her KB throughout this video. So Nina asked her mother, and of course her mother said it was fine because, she knew this girl, she knew the family. It was someone she felt very comfortable with and comfortable with Nina spending time with. However, as a few days passed, Peacha would end up receiving a phone call that would change everything. KB's mother ended up being on the other end of that phone call, and she was asking to speak to her daughter. It turns out that KB ended up telling her mother that she was going to spend the weekend at Nina's house, and Nina told her mother that she was going to spend the weekend at KB's house. So where were these 2 teenage girls? This is when Peacha would learn that KB actually had a bit of a history of running away for a few days at a time, and KB's mother ended up telling Peacha not to worry, that the girls would eventually come back. However, this wasn't like Nina. Nina didn't run away. Nina didn't do drugs. She wasn't, one of those street kids that would run around and cause trouble. She was a pretty good girl all around. So Peacha was rightfully concerned that her daughter was unaccounted for that entire weekend. So Peacha ended up calling around to Nina's friends, to local shelters, trying to figure out where her daughter could be. But Nina nor KB were anywhere to be found. And given the family's history with CPS after that whole situation that had happened previously, Peacha was scared at this point to call the police to report her daughter missing. And honestly, after all of the research that I have done and all of the videos I've done on the Canadian police, especially involving our Indigenous people, I honestly feel like even if Peacha had called, that not much would have been done, which is really, really sad. 2 days later, Nina was still not home. And this is when Peacha would find out that the body of a teenage girl was found at the Edmonton Springs Golf Course. On April 4th of 2005, a groundskeeper inspecting the 4th fairway of the Edmonton Springs Golf Course Resort, located about 30 kilometers west of downtown Edmonton, found a teen's body as the winter snow was receding. After hearing this information, Peach would immediately call the police to inquire about the body that was found. And unsurprisingly, she was met with the most outlandish questions, in my opinion. The police started asking her if Nina had a habit, if she drank, if she had ran away before. Which, why did that matter? We're talking about the body of a young teenage girl that was found. Why did it matter if she drank? Why did it matter if she did drugs? Why did it matter if she was a street worker? Why did it matter any of that information? All you should be focused on right now is identifying the body. But as we know from the research that we've done, it seems like the police seem to have a stigma about our Indigenous people. They look at them as just being drunks or working the streets or, et cetera, which is definitely not how it is. There's definitely issues within the community, of course, but that shouldn't be the first thing that's jumped to. They're people just like anyone else. So why are these questions being asked? In my opinion, I think those are questions that should have been asked after the fact, not immediately. But let me know how you feel. Either way, Peach would end up providing the police with Nina's picture, and in the end, the body was identified as 13-year-old Nina Courtepatte. So what happened here? How did this vibrant young girl who had so much life ahead of her end up dead on a golf course? Well, this is where Nina's case ties into the previous videos that I've done on the Edmonton Killing Fields. 2 days prior to Nina's murder, 19-year-old Joseph LeBoucan, along with 34-year-old Michael Briscoe and 17-year-old Stephanie Bird, who, mind you, I found out that they were dating, a 34-year-old and a 17-year-old. Like, what the fuck? This case will rattle you. It just keeps getting crazier and crazier and crazier, and the details are just, they're mind-blowing. Either way, these 3 sick individuals would end up murdering 33-year-old prostitute Ellie Mae Myers, who we covered in my previous video. I also think in the previous video I said Joseph was 21 years old, but he was actually 19 once I did some more research. It was kind of hard to find everyone's exact ages because the articles would list their ages of like when they were in the court processing instead of like how old they were when they committed the crimes. So to clear that up, Joseph was 19. Honestly, it's even creepier knowing that he was 19 years old, that he was committing acts like this. On April 1st of 2005, the trio would end up picking Ellie up from the infamous 118th Avenue in Edmonton, a very popular area for street workers. And according to sources, Ellie was working the block to make money for crack cocaine. They would end up taking Ellie to a farmer's field near Fort Saskatchewan, where Michael Briscoe and Stephanie would leave the vehicle so that Joseph could have sex with her. At some point, Stephanie said that Ellie began running away from the 2 men as they began hitting her. The 2 men would return to the vehicle, and at this point, Stephanie said that Ellie was laying on the ground, very bloody but still alive. Ellie would end up telling Stephanie that she wasn't going to tell anyone if they let her go, that she would go up to the highway and tell someone that she had fallen and injured herself. Stephanie ended up asking Ellie if she could get up, and Ellie said no, that she couldn't. And I think at this point she was also gurgling blood and struggling to breathe. At some point later, Joseph and Michael Briscoe ended up going back over to Stephanie and telling her to wait in the car. And a few minutes later, the 2 men would eventually get back to the vehicle without Ellie. A month later, Ellie's body would end up being found, and an autopsy would show that she died from massive cranial trauma. She suffered multiple injuries to her head, including extensive fractures of her skull, a split scalp, and a detached upper jaw. The top of her left pinky finger was also missing. But if we jump back, the next day on April 2nd of 2005, Joseph and a 16-year-old girl known as Buffy were in Michael Briscoe and Stephanie's hotel room where Joseph was also staying. And he ended up showing Buffy the tip of Ellie's finger, which he kept between 2 pieces of bread stored in the freezer. And as I said in the previous video, this whole finger sandwich bread situation is still so weird to me. It's giving Dexter, it's giving Trophy. It's very, very creepy, given he is only 19 years old. This day, Joseph also allegedly told friends that picking up Ellie and killing her gave him such an adrenaline rush that he wanted to kill someone again. Apparently, he had said it about 5 or 6 times that day that he wanted to kill someone. And that day, they'd set their sights on a new target, 13-year-old Nina Courtepatte, who they would end up calling the Chosen One. We know that that day, 5 people were involved with Nina's death. 19-year-old Joseph LeBoucan, 34-year-old Michael Briscoe, 16-year-old Buffy, 17-year-old Michael Williams, and 17-year-old Stephanie Bird. And it's alleged that the 2 17-year-olds knew Nina. And that day, the group of self-described mall rats would end up killing again. Now, I went through hundreds of pages of testimony on this case and tried to piece together what exactly happened that night, and everyone gave a different recounting of the events. And the articles didn't have that much information, so I did my best to piece together all of the information that I found that makes the most sense, but I will go through and let you know if certain people said certain things. Keep in mind, just about 2 days before all of this, they murdered Ellie Mae, but her body wouldn't be found for about a month after this. So the police had no idea. And Joseph LeBuchan is cited to be the ringleader of the group, the one who is a truly sadistic killer. And I would also second that Michael Williams is also a sadistic person as well, which let me know if you agree at the end of the video. Now, according to Michael Briscoe, he just drove the vehicle that night and had no idea what the group was going to do to Nina. However, it seemed like no one really believed him at the end of the day, and the term willful blindness was thrown around a lot. Also keep in mind that Michael Briscoe, who was innocent in all of this, who was just a bystander, was 34 fucking years old hanging out with a group of teenagers. Everyone else involved in this was 19 or younger. So give me a break that you did not know what was going on, especially since 2 days prior, he was involved in the murder of Ellie, which he never would face charges for. I will just let you know now. Michael Briscoe would also testify that he never harmed Nina that night, and he was actually afraid for his own life. However, other witnesses testified that he actually was involved and was around when violence was previously discussed before anything actually even happened, and he also helped choose the tools that were used in Nina's murder. And we'll talk a lot about the stances that every individual had a little bit later in their testimonies, but I just wanted to let you know right off the bat that Michael Briscoe acted as if he was so innocent, but he was definitely involved. And he was also involved in Ellie's murder, even though he was acquitted for it. Again, 34 years old hanging out with teenagers. So what exactly happened here? Around noon that day, 16-year-old Buffy, who was a seemingly drug-addicted teen who spent most of her time living at the mall, ended up meeting up with her boyfriend of 2 months, 17-year-old Michael Williams, and they met up at the bus terminal on the south side of the West Edmonton Mall. He had just smoked meth before they met up, and it was a prearranged meeting. After meeting up, they walked through the mall and then headed over to Humpty's restaurant, which was on the north side of the mall, and they ended up ordering some food. Now, by some weird happenstance of evil, they ended up running into Joseph, Stephanie Bird, and Michael Briscoe at the restaurant. And the group ended up sitting at tables next to each other so that they could chat. Now, as I said earlier, I'd found out that 17-year-old Stephanie and 34-year-old Michael Briscoe had been dating for around 6 months at this point, and I will say dating lightly because I don't think a 17-year-old and a 34-year-old is consensual in my opinion. And according to the narrative, Michael Briscoe was trying to help Stephanie stay off of drugs. She had a drug issue he was trying to help her overcome. And she testified that Michael Briscoe spent all of his time with her so that she wasn't running around cheating on him. She said that he would not let her out of his sight with anyone that he didn't know or trust anyone with her that he thought might hurt her, which in my opinion, if your partner is choosing who you're allowed to be around, that is giving DV in my opinion. There's something really wrong going on here. The age gap, the fact that she's a minor, and then he's controlling even the people that she could be around, and there seems to be drugs involved. This just seems like a very bad situation. It doesn't seem like a healthy relationship in my opinion. They were also living in a motel. I don't know. The layers of this case are just so wild to me. Like the fact that this grown man is dating a literal minor, trying to help her get off drugs and won't let her run around and cheat on him or whatever. It's just so weird, and it's just so messed up. And then we have another drug addict 16-year-old that's dating another drug addicted 17-year-old who is smoking meth before they hang out. It's just a disaster waiting to happen in my opinion, and the ball just kept rolling down the hill. And if you thought the dynamics and confusion of this group wasn't enough, it turns out that Stephanie had actually originally dated Joseph, and they had been dating about a year prior before he just mysteriously vanished out of thin air. So obviously their relationship ended because he just vanished. So let's talk a little bit about Joseph LeBuchan, because 19-year-old Joseph LeBuchan seemed to have a troubled life, but there's honestly not that much information on his backstory, which I really wish there was more, because there's just something about this man, this 19-year-old who's just going around murdering people, has this sick fantasy about wanting to kill people. I just wanted to know more. I find it very fascinating when you look into the mind of a serial killer and what might have caused them to act that way. But there's honestly not that much information. We do know that around the age of 13 or 14, he left his parents' home in Fort St. John, British Columbia, because he had problems with his stepfather. So it makes me wonder if there was abuse in the home, if there was something going on where he felt he needed to leave. And it really makes me wonder what caused him to be the way that he is. Because a 13 or 14-year-old running away from home, like that is very, very young. It seems like he ran away from British Columbia and ended up in Edmonton for a long period of time until the ages of around 17 or 18, and then he returned back to Fort St. John. And it seems like the majority of his time spent was at the West Edmonton Mall when he was in Edmonton, which is how I guess he made friends with this jolly gang of killers that he would end up meeting. In early 2005, Joseph was once again living in Fort St. John, British Columbia. I'm guessing that's after he was dating Stephanie and mysteriously vanished. He ended up just leaving and going back to British Columbia. However, at the end of March of 2005, his friends in Fort St. John ended up driving him back to Edmonton so that he could go meet with a lawyer that had acted for him in relation to a personal injury claim situation that was going on. The claim ended up being settled, and he had to go to Edmonton to basically finalize the documentation for it and get his settlement funds. His friends ended up staying with him for a few days, but there ended up being an unforeseen delay with finalizing the documents, so the friends ended up not being able to stay that long because it was going to be extended, and they ended up leaving Joseph in Edmonton and driving back home without him. However, shortly after his friends left, Joseph realized his wallet was stolen and he had no money and no ID now. And again, just by a weird chance, Joseph would end up running into Stephanie at the City Center Mall. Now, obviously having no money and no ID, Joseph needed a place to stay because he couldn't rent a motel, he couldn't do really anything, having no identification or money. So he ended up asking Stephanie for a place to stay. And this is when she would end up introducing him to her new boyfriend, Michael Briscoe. And the two hit it off apparently, which again is so weird to me that you're introducing your ex that mysteriously vanished to your new 34-year-old boyfriend that's protecting you from cheating on him with people. And yeah, it's just weird. But, you know, they all hit it off apparently, and Joseph was offered to stay at the motel with them, and he accepted, saying that he would pay them about $1,000 from the settlement once he got the money. But let's get back to April. Now, after the group ended up eating at that restaurant, they decided they were going to dine and dash, and they ran out and headed over to Michael Briscoe's 1991 Ford Tempo in the parking lot. The group then drove back around the mall. So it's a really big mall. So they were on the very far north side outside of the mall at this restaurant. They got in his car and drove back around the mall so that they could be closer to an entrance they wanted to go into. So they drove over to that entrance and then they went back to wander inside the mall. At some point, they would end up meeting up with a male friend known as Jay Schomburg in documents, who would end up joining the group for a joyride around town. During this joyride, it said that Joseph and Michael Williams were talking about wanting to kill people. At some point, they ended up pulling the car over, and at this point, Joseph ended up asking Buffy if she wanted to join them while they went to kill someone that night. According to Buffy, she didn't take them seriously. She thought they were joking. Everyone as a collective group thought they were joking, and that's the way that the narrative goes. Although I don't see how it would be funny to like jokingly be talking about killing people. You think you'd be talking about other things while, you know, getting high and driving around town. But apparently after this, no one else talked about murder for the rest of that drive. Jay Schomburg would eventually be dropped off, and then the group would drive over to Stephanie and Michael Briscoe's motel room. It's thought that this is where some of the weapons were picked up. At the end of this drive, it was still daylight out, and the group ended up heading back over to West Edmonton Mall. Inside, they ended up splitting off into two groups. Joseph went with Michael Williams and Buffy, and Stephanie went with Michael Briscoe. After about an hour, the two groups ended up meeting back up at the bus terminal. Michael Williams ended up having a joint on him, so him and Stephanie shared it as they all took another joyride around town and then ended up back at the mall again. This is when Michael Briscoe, Stephanie, and Joseph would end up leaving the vehicle, going back into the mall to hunt for someone to kill, while Michael Williams and Buffy stayed back in the car to have sex in it. Either way, Joseph ended up saying that he wanted to pick someone out of the crowd at the Phase 3 food court that he was going to murder, which he ended up picking someone out of this group of kids that were standing in front of the arcade. He would then indicate that he had made his choice, but he wouldn't tell the group who he had chosen. Stephanie did, however, say that Joseph had threatened her, saying that if she didn't do what he wanted her to, he was going to kill her too. Meanwhile, that day, 13-year-old Nina Courtepatte and her 15-year-old best friend KB were playing at the arcade in the Phase 3 food court. As the girls played and chatted with the other group of kids that were around, Joseph and Stephanie ended up approaching them. Now, according to KB, she had known Stephanie and she'd known Stephanie for a while. However, she'd only met Joseph on one other occasion. But according to Stephanie, she didn't know KB at all. In my opinion, I think Stephanie did know KB, and after you kind of hear about the dynamics of it all, how she kind of protected KB and all of this, I feel like she did know her in a way. Especially since they were all teenagers and they all hung around this mall all the time. I feel like they knew each other to some extent. And I honestly don't trust a word Stephanie has to say anyways, so we'll just leave it there, but I wanted to mention that there's two conflicting stories with this. Either way, Stephanie and Joseph would end up inviting the two teenage girls over to a bush party that was going to happen that night, saying there's going to be drugs and alcohol and that there was going to be like 200 people. It was going to be this crazy wild party in the woods. And of course, you know, Nina and KB were excited. What early 2000s smallish town teenager would not be excited to be invited to some big party that all the, older cool kids were going to. So of course they said yes, they wanted to go to this party. So Joseph ended up telling the two girls to wait at the mall and they'd pick them up later on. But of course that wasn't actually the plan. Unbeknownst to the two girls, Joseph was returning back to Michael Briscoe's car with a smile on his face, saying, and I quote, "We found someone," end quote. However, he still didn't specify who he had picked. The group then killed some time by driving around again, stopping at McDonald's for some more food. And from the assumption that the rest of the group had, they were only going to be picking up one girl that night, which Joseph allegedly told the group they were actually going to take to a rave or a party. A bunch of people out of this 5 twisted bunch said that they actually thought they were going to a party, and that earlier that day Joseph had said he wanted to get laid, so they were assuming that the girl that he had picked out at the mall he wanted to have sex with, he wanted to sleep with, not that he wanted to murder her. So about 45 minutes later, Nina and KB ended up being picked up around 12:27 a.m. on April 3rd, so it's now the next day. Stephanie and Joseph would end up leading the two girls out of the entrance 2 of the mall towards Michael Briscoe's 1991 Ford Tempo. A mall security video of the area around entrance 2 would show that just after midnight, that 3 girls would end up leaving the mall arm in arm. And when KB was shown this footage later on, she would identify herself, Stephanie Bird, and Nina Courtepatte. Not far behind them, the video shows a heavy-built young man following them out, and this person is thought to be Joseph Labukin. As the 4 of them ended up approaching the car, the girls would realize there were more people in it, including Michael Briscoe, Michael Williams, and Buffy. And from there, the group would end up heading off towards this party. So let's talk about the layout of this car. Michael Briscoe was driving, Stephanie was in the front passenger seat, Nina sat on Joseph's lap behind the driver's seat, Buffy was sat on Michael Williams' lap behind the front passenger seat, and KB sat in the middle seat between the 2 in the back. During the drive into the city, Joseph kept talking about how fun this party was going to be and how he wasn't going to let anything happen to them. As music blasted in the car, it was said that Michael Williams and Buffy were making out and that Nina was making out with Joseph, and then KB was making out with Joseph at one point. It was just seemed to be like a very fun, uplifted car ride, considering what was about to happen after. Michael Briscoe was said to just be driving straight ahead. No one was telling him directions. He knew exactly where they were heading. Although it seems like Michael Briscoe had some kind of anger going on inside of him. You'll hear multiple times about him yelling. It said that during the car ride, he yelled at the group to shut up because they were being too loud, and that he just seemed angry for some reason. But as I said, there was no party that they were heading to. Instead, the group would end up taking the girls to the Edmonton Springs golf course. KB and Nina began to grow suspicious when the car stopped at a very dark and secluded green gate, and they see no signs of a big, massive party happening. Everyone ended up getting out of the car into the dark, quiet night without saying a word. Michael Briscoe, Joseph, and Stephanie ended up going to the trunk of the car, opening it up and looking inside, doing something, while the rest of the group went through the green gate and started walking into the woods. Meanwhile, back at the car, Michael Briscoe would ask Joseph if they were at the right place, and he would respond by saying yes. Unbeknownst to Nina and KB, the 3 were obtaining the weapons of choice that night: a wrench, sledgehammer, and pliers. And as I said from testimony, Buffy and Stephanie said over and over again that they thought that they were actually all going to a party, but I don't know how much I really believe them. Their actions that night just seem too prepared, in my opinion. From there, Buffy, Joseph, Michael Williams, KB, and Nina all walked through the gate down a path. Stephanie and Michael Briscoe didn't immediately follow. Joseph kept saying, and I quote, "I think it's this way, I think it's that way," end quote. He just kept, pretending he was trying to figure out where they were going. And there didn't really seem to be a rhyme or reason to the direction that they were walking. The group walked over gravel, they walked over mud, and then they eventually ended up in a grassy field. But it was extremely dark out, it was hard to see, there weren't really lights anywhere, so it was about 10 to 15 minutes that they walked, and during the walk, they kept talking about how fun this party was going to be. Stephanie is said to have reappeared when the group arrived at the grassy area. KB started to grow suspicious again at this point that there wasn't really going to be a party, but Joseph reassured her that the people that were running the party were just waiting for them all to arrive before they started to, set it up. Some of the group started yelling things like, "Hey, where are you?" as if they were trying to locate where the party was. Now here's where things will get hard to hear, but I think if we consider that Nina had to experience all of this for herself, that we can at least sit here and talk about it and hear it. Because I think it's very important to understand how truly twisted and evil that these people are. At some point, Buffy and Joseph would start talking about a ritual where they would kill people and bring people back from the dead. kind of like vampire stuff, which again, when you learn that Buffy was like a homeless teenager, she was addicted to crystal meth, she had actually sharpened her teeth, she drank blood, she wore throwing knives as jewelry. She was like another level of like emo. She'd actually got her nickname Buffy from Buffy the Vampire Slayer. So hearing that information and getting a good picture of her, because we don't really have an image of her per se, I wasn't really shocked to read that they were talking about like vampires and bringing people back from the dead and stuff like that. Joseph was also apparently talking about psychotic killers, bringing people back from the dead like 500 years ago. And as I said, it didn't really surprise me when I knew that information about Buffy. Joseph, on the other hand, is just another level of twisted, but it also apparently didn't really freak KB or Nina out much because they weren't really surprised that this friend group was talking about stuff like that, it seemed like. After this conversation is around the time that Michael Briscoe met back up with the group. According to KB, at this point when they were in this grassy area, it was so hard to see out. It was super dark. The only light was from the moon that was shining above. But this is where things would eventually take a turn for the worst. Unbeknownst to KB and Nina, Joseph went over to Stephanie and told her that she needed to use the wrench on Nina. Stephanie claims that she initially refused, but that Joseph angrily repeated the instructions to her about 3 or 4 times before she finally decided that she would do it. Out of nowhere, Stephanie would pull out a nearly 2-foot wrench that she was concealing on her person, which was actually given to her by her 34-year-old boyfriend, Michael Briscoe, and she used this large wrench to bash Nina in the center of her back, which caused her to stumble forward and almost fall. Stephanie said, and I quote, "You're pissing me off," end quote, which Nina replied by asking her why, like what did she do wrong? Nina ended up running towards Joseph for safety. This is when Joseph would end up wrapping his arms around Nina and whispering something extremely frightening in her ear that no one really knows what he said, but whatever it was terrifying because Nina immediately started screaming and saying, and I quote, "Let me go, don't do this," end quote. And I can't even imagine that she's only 13 years old. Keep that in mind. She's still a child at that point. She's maybe a young teen, but she's still young. And she thought she was going to be going to this fun party with these older kids that were going to take care of her. Maybe, you know, she had a little crush on Joseph. They were kissing in the car, which is also kind of weird to me, a 19-year-old and a 13-year-old, but it's adds to the layers of, you know, pedophilia happening in this case. But, you know, at 13, looking up to an older teenager and to realize that sinking fear and that trust just being ripped away from her, that she thought this was going to be a safe environment and that one second it was and the next second it wasn't, I can't imagine that fear and that terror. This is when Joseph would end up letting Nina go and telling her that she needed to take her pants off. But Nina didn't comply. She just stood there saying, and I quote, "Why would you do this? Why are you doing this?" end quote. But she did not get the answer she wanted. KB realized at this point that they were in danger, and it said that she sat in the grass, shivering from the cold. Joseph then yelled at Nina to lay down, but she refused to. So Joseph ended up ripping off Nina's pants and her underwear himself, and then assisted by either Michael Briscoe or Michael Williams, they pulled Nina to the ground and held her down by her wrists. Now, as I said, Michael Briscoe claims that he was not involved with any of this, that he just stood by and watched everything happen. However, there are multiple accounts where Michael Briscoe is actively involved in Nina being attacked and murdered. And in the first version I seen, he was holding her wrist down, but then I seen other versions where Michael Williams was. So either way, in my opinion, I think he was involved more than he's letting on. So I'm going to go by this one version. And in this version, Michael Briscoe is holding Nina down, and he allegedly told Nina to shut up and be quiet. At this point, Buffy ended up whispering to Nina that she was supposed to die. As Nina screamed and tried to get away, Michael put his hand over her mouth as the rest of the group watched. KB also claimed that she witnessed Joseph on top of Nina holding her down, but she says it was so dark she couldn't really make out what exactly was happening. But what was happening was Nina's worst nightmare as Joseph began to SA her. Nina cried out that he was hurting her, but he didn't care. Stephanie, who claims that she was sick by the idea of Nina being SA'd, ended up going over and sitting by KB on the grass. She allegedly forced Michael Williams to give KB his jacket because she was shivering. She then told Joseph that KB didn't need to be witnessing what was happening, and Joseph ended up telling her to take her to the car. It said that Michael Briscoe then went up to KB, looked her dead in the eyes, and told her in a scary voice that if she screamed, he was going to have to do it. And he said this while holding a belt in his hand, leading KB to assume that he was going to strangle her. Stephanie then grabbed KB by the arm and took her back to the car. Back at the car, they got in without saying a word, and Stephanie ended up turning on the car because it was really cold out, and she also ended up handing KB a bunch of Nina's stuff that was left in the car. Now, considering the fact that Stephanie says that she didn't know KB at all, in my opinion, she's being very comforting to KB considering she was a stranger. allegedly a stranger. And this is some of the stuff that makes me believe that she actually knew her and she had a relationship with her prior. The fact that she was like trying to protect her in a way. But meanwhile, back at the grassy field, the attack was continuing. After Joseph finished, Michael Williams took his turn essaying Nina while Michael Briscoe held her down. After being attacked and essayed by two men, I can't imagine what was going through this 13-year-old girl's mind when Buffy ended up handing her back her underwear and pants, and she was struggling to put them back on. I also want to note that Buffy was apparently pissed off at this point that Michael Williams, her boyfriend, had had sex with someone while she was present. Like, I get Buffy is also a young teenage girl and she was on drugs during most of this, but your man just essayed a 13-year-old girl in front of you and you're mad that he cheated on you. The level of delusion among this group is just, it's insane. Also, Buffy testified that no one had held Nina down during any of this, but honestly, I believe KB's story over Buffy's. That's just my opinion. I just don't believe this girl. The fact that she's mad at her man for cheating on her, what? I also think they're all kind of trying to protect themselves, but it gets worse. Next, Joseph ended up telling Nina that they were going to beat her to death. And Nina said, and I quote, no, make it fast so it doesn't hurt, end quote. But they would not. Joseph would then attempt to cut Nina's throat with a throwing knife, but it wasn't sharp enough. So he then took that large wrench, stood behind Nina, put the wrench around her, over her neck, and began to choke her with it. And Nina ended up falling to the ground as Joseph attacked her. Now, this next detail I seen written in the testimonies, and it made me sick reading it. However, we will later learn that it might not have happened, and I pray to God that it did not happen to her. But according to testimony, while Nina was on the ground, Michael Williams made Buffy put her foot on Nina's stomach while he drove the sledgehammer into her crotch, into her genital region. A sledgehammer, over and over again as Joseph strangled her. And it's then said that Joseph and Michael Williams took turns hitting her in the crotch with it. Why someone would make this up and lie about this, I don't know. It's just sick. And again, I hope that did not happen to her because I can't imagine the level of pain that would cause. I'm pretty sure it was Buffy who said this happened, and she also noted that there was significant bleeding and that Nina was making gurgling sounds and trying to move away. I just can't imagine, like, why would you lie about that? Because again, as I said, we'll later learn it most likely didn't happen. Why you would lie about that, I don't know, other than just being absolutely sadistic and wanting to say that you inflicted the maximum amount of torture on this poor little girl. What we do know is that both men would then take that sledgehammer and hit Nina in the head several times with it, and they hit her over and over again until she stopped moving. Joseph would then take the throwing knife and stab Nina in the neck with it, and then ask Buffy to do the same thing, which she complied. Michael Williams and Joseph then tried to set Nina's pants on fire, but they were thankfully unsuccessful. The group would then eventually go back to the car. KB would later testify that Joseph returned back to that vehicle covered in blood from his elbows to his fingertips. His jeans were also covered in blood, and that he took a water bottle and started washing the blood off himself. It was noted that he was apparently one of the only ones with blood on him though, although I'm pretty sure Michael Williams also had blood on himself. As I said earlier, Joseph was thought to be the ringleader, but as you just heard, Michael Williams also did exactly the same things that Joseph did. After this, everyone would get into the vehicle and they would leave without Nina. KB claims that she didn't know that her best friend was dead until days later when she escaped from the group. During the drive back, they ended up telling KB that they had beat Nina up and then left her to run home naked from the golf course. Buffy then took the two throwing knives out of her backpack, which were covered in blood, and said that she'd stuck one of the knives in Nina's neck. She allegedly said that she felt really bad about it, but that she wanted to do it again. No one else said anything about what happened to Nina, and Joseph ended up threatening KB, saying that if she said anything or left them, he was going to put her in a ditch. From there, the group stopped at two stores, the second which they stole cigarettes from, and then they drove back to the Windmill Motel at the outskirts of Edmonton, where Michael Briscoe and Stephanie were staying. KB and Stephanie ended up staying at the motel while the rest of the group ended up driving Michael Williams back home. After that, the rest of the group, which was Michael Briscoe, Stephanie, Buffy, Joseph, and KB, then all stayed at that motel for around 2 to 3 days. They essentially kidnapped her and held her captive in this hotel room. At some point, Joseph ended up asking KB if she would ever forgive him for what he did, and she said that she wouldn't. After a few days, the group ended up going back to the West Edmonton Mall, but KB was still back at that motel room. And the group was going back to the mall so that they could steal like clothing and stuff. At one point, while Buffy was at the mall, she would meet up with another mall rat, which is a 15-year-old girl named KBZ in documents. According to her, that day, that group had come to her and asked her if she wanted to go to a party, but she said she wasn't really into it. Then in the early hours of April 3rd, she claims that when she went home from the mall, Michael Williams approached her at her doorstep and he was covered in blood and said that he had killed someone. And she ended up telling him that he was going to go to jail then. Later that night, KBZ ended up going back to West Edmonton Mall, and there she would meet up with Buffy and run into her in one of the bathrooms. She claims that Buffy ended up pulling out some throwing knives, which were covered in blood, and washing them in the sink there. When police would later show her pictures of these knives, she would identify them as the same knives. During all of this, Nina's body was being discovered and news of her murder was starting to circulate around the media. Joseph ended up disappearing again, leaving Stephanie and KB to go to West Edmonton Mall alone. And while they were at the mall, they would miraculously run into KB's mother and her aunt who were searching for her. They would end up showing KB pictures of Nina's clothing that had been published in a newspaper, and this is when KB realized the reality of what happened to her best friend, and she began to cry. Now, when KB was initially questioned by police on April 7th and 8th, she had actually lied and told them that she had last seen Nina at the West Edmonton Mall and she had no idea what happened to her. Now, I'm guessing she lied out of fear because Joseph made all those threats to her that if, she said anything, he was going to kill her. However, on April 10th, KB would eventually tell the truth and tell, the testimony that I ended up telling you all. And while we're here, let's talk about what the medical examiner had to say about the state of Nina's body. At autopsy, Dr. Dowling observed 15 lacerations distributed over Nina's scalp and face. There was also an open injury to the right side of her lower jaw, and she was not sure if this was a laceration or a stab wound. There were also 2 very superficial cuts to the front of her neck, as well as some very superficial cuts or linear scrapes over the right side of her face. There were depression fractures on the right side of her skull associated with a laceration, bruises, and bleeding beneath the membrane that covers the right side of her brain. There were also similar injuries on the left side of her brain. There was also a midline fracture on the lower jaw. There was a number of bruises and scrapes scattered over her face, neck, trunk, arms, and legs. There were 2 small circular abrasions just above the collarbone on the left side of the front of her chest. The back surface of both of her hands were covered with bruises extending to the fingers. There were no visible injuries to the genitalia or the anus, which, as I said, is interesting considering what the others recounted happened with that mallet. But according to the medical examiner, he found no signs that there was any injuries to her genitalia that would show a mallet had hit her there. And he said that if a mallet had been used in that way, that he would have seen signs of injury. So again, I truly hope that they just made that all up as some sick, twisted ploy to make themselves sound cooler or something. Nina's cause of death was ruled as a blunt cranial trauma, most consistent with Nina having been struck several times with a heavy blunt object. Dr. Dowling also took samples from Nina's body that were later submitted for DNA testing. A semen sample taken from Nina's vagina matched Michael Williams. Other DNA was also present. Michael Briscoe was, however, excluded, but Joseph was not. An anal swab showed at least 2 sets of DNA in addition to Nina's own. However, there was no DNA match for either of those samples. However, Joseph and Michael Williams could not be excluded from those DNA samples. DNA from semen of 2 males was also found in another sample taken from a slightly different area of the crotch of Nina's jeans and her underwear. The test results of one of those samples establish a match to Michael Williams' DNA, and the other could not be determined. And as I said, after reading through the entire indictment for Michael Briscoe and Joseph, it was a shit show trying to piece this case together just because of so many varying stories. I talked about how much Michael Briscoe claimed that he wasn't involved, but in his testimony, Joseph also claimed that he was an innocent little bean who was flabbergasted by everything that happened in front of him. It was ridiculous. As I said, Michael Briscoe claims he only drove the car and stood back and watched everything happen. Funny enough, Michael Williams is the only one who took responsibility for anything, admitting that he did have sex with Nina, and him, along with Buffy, also admitted to being involved in killing Nina. But then they also both put a lot of blame on someone else, such as Joseph, for forcing them to do stuff. Stephanie's entire version of events was also blaming Joseph for her actions, saying that he forced her to do everything. The only person, in my opinion, who's even halfway reliable is KB's testimony. And from her testimony, it seems like she was in complete shock and essentially disassociating from everything that was happening in front of her, which I wouldn't blame her, experiencing all of that stuff happening in front of you. And she was only 15 years old, seeing all of this happen, her friend being attacked and essayed, and then later being murdered, obviously, and then being kidnapped by this group and held hostage essentially for days after. So I wouldn't be shocked if she tried to block a lot of what happened out of her memory. And it was also, again, extremely dark out. They were in the middle of a golf course in the woods. So again, there were a lot of details that were very skewed, such as that mallet that some of them said was used, but then there was no evidence to show that it did. What we do know is that all of these individuals were present when Nina was murdered. Joseph LeBuchan would end up being charged with first-degree murder for the murder of Ellie Myers. He would end up being sentenced to to a life sentence, which in Canada is 25 years without parole. He would also get the same sentence for Nina's murder. And again, I really wanted to know more about Joseph, but there's really not much. If you know anything about Joseph Labuchan, if you have any articles you can send me, let me know down below because I am extremely interested. But from the very little we do know about this then 19-year-old boy, man, whatever you want to call him, he sounded like a very sick and twisted individual. He was into essaying his victims. He was into murdering them. He got off on it. It seemed like he kept trophies. He talked about wanting to do it and the rush it gave him. And to think that he was doing all of this at only 19 years old, it really makes me wonder if he has other victims out there, as well as if he hadn't been caught. I definitely think he would have had more victims stacked up. Again, the fact that he was doing this at only 19 years old says enough. Now, in a very crazy turn of events, Michael Briscoe would actually end up being cleared for the first-degree murder of Ellie, and this was due to Stephanie being an unreliable witness. Also, keep in mind they were dating. And the fact that he was let off, even though he was clearly present at her murder, even if he allegedly didn't do anything, even though Stephanie claimed he did, they essentially couldn't determine beyond a reasonable doubt that Michael knew she was going to be murdered or that she was murdered or whatever. Again, he was just a driver in all of this. However, thankfully, the odds were not in his favor when it came to Nina's murder. Michael Briscoe was also sentenced to 25 years without the possibility of parole for the first-degree murder, essay, and kidnapping of Nina. Now, here's where things will piss you off, because Stephanie Bird would only end up being charged with 12 years in prison for manslaughter, kidnapping, and aggravated essay in Nina's death. And then, on top of that, her sentence ended up being reduced by 3 years to credit for time spent in custody, which in my opinion is a slap in the face, and Nina's family was very upset by this. Michael Williams, as I said, is in top tier with Joseph Labuchan, in my opinion. I think he is just as twisted, just as evil. He did everything that Joseph did, but Joseph was considered the ringleader in all of this. But clearly, Michael Williams is also extremely fucked up in the head, and I would also be very interested to know his backstory. What led him to think essaying and murdering women and girls would be a smart decision? Michael Williams would plead guilty in December of 2006, and he would be sentenced as an adult. Considering he was 17, they sentenced him as an adult, thankfully, to life in prison, just like Michael Briscoe and Joseph was, so he got the same sentence as them. Now, I know this is a very sensitive topic, the topic of transgenderism, but keep in mind, Michael Williams SA'd a 13-year-old girl. He murdered her. He helped murder her, among other stuff that I'm sure he did. He is now in prison saying that he is transgender and trying to get himself into a women's prison, which is a whole nother topic for another day. I definitely think there are levels to that, and it's a case-by-case basis, in my opinion. I definitely think in certain situations, if someone is transgender, they would be more at risk being in a men's prison than, or vice versa, etc., etc. However, considering this then man SA'd a child and murdered her with a group of individuals, it's, in my opinion, not safe, considering his past, to put him in a prison with other women. But again, that is just my opinion. I know that's a very hot topic. I know that's a very controversial topic, but I wanted to include that in here because there were a bunch of articles talking about how he was trying to get himself now into a women's prison. I think that's not protecting the other women in the prison if you were to put him in that prison. But I just wanted to say my piece on that because considering what he did to Nina, I think that's a huge safety violation, but that's just my opinion. So now that we talked about all of those individuals, let's talk about Buffy, who was 16 when all of this happened. And if you remember, she was also a very active participant in Nina's essay and murder. In 2009, Buffy would eventually be sentenced to 4 years in custody, which would then be followed by another 3 years of supervised probation. So she was never sentenced to any prison time, it seems like. She would also eventually be paroled in 2016 at the age of 27 years old. And at that time, she was then engaged to be married and working a full-time job. Now, I have such mixed feelings about this. Canada is known and all about reforming their prisoners. We have so many cases about this, and in my opinion, in some instances, I can understand that, and I do think reforming someone is better. However, when there are situations where someone murders someone, which we have seen in multiple cases, there was the Greyhound murders where I can't remember his name, but the man literally murdered an innocent man on board, another innocent man that he didn't know, complete stranger, brutally murdered him in front of all of the other passengers, was literally eating him. It's a whole case. Let me know if you want me to cover it. It's terrible. They sent that man to a psychiatric hospital, said they cured him, and set him free on the public. This also happened out west. So the fact that they let people go, they don't sentence them to any prison time, and then say they cured them and let them go into the public. In my opinion, it's an injustice when it's a crime like that to the family. It's an injustice to the victim. And I don't think you can really cure someone, in my opinion, if they go that far. Now, I said I have mixed opinions with Buffy's sentence and her being out free to this day now, because in one way, she was only 16 years old. She was addicted to drugs. She was essentially homeless. She was a very troubled teen. And I do think someone like that can, be reformed. If that was all that it was, and she did some petty crime, I think she could be reformed then. I think she would deserve to be reformed to, have her life bettered for herself. She was in a very bad place. She was hanging around bad people, and she was, vulnerable and impressionable at that time. However, she was an active participant in Nina's essay and murder. She allegedly held Nina down. She was actively saying how they were going to kill her and frightening her and terrorizing Nina. She was present while she was being essayed and didn't say anything, didn't do anything, didn't try to stop it. After the fact, she was allowed to run around free, unlike KB was, it seemed like. And she didn't tell anyone. She didn't get help. She didn't stop anyone from, possibly doing more. She also admitted to using her own throwing knives to stab Nina. And then after the fact was cleaning up the evidence, was cleaning the knives, was destroying the evidence. She was an active participant in Nina's murder, and she was never sentenced to jail time. And she, unlike Nina, is allowed out there to get married, to have a life, to have a job, to have children, and Nina is dead. And Nina will never get that. And I do think if this case happened in the US, she would have had a much harsher sentence. Now, after hearing all of that, I'm not finished here yet, because as we know, there are a lot of unsolved murders in and around Edmonton, Alberta. And I've seen at least 2 other names mentioned where people speculate that Joseph Labuchin and this group of his merry, evil fucking friends could have been involved in, especially since these 2 girls ended up going missing just months before Nina did at the exact same mall. West Edmonton Mall, to be specific, where we know that this group always hung around and was very friendly with all the other teens there. On February 18th of 2005, 19-year-old Renee Lynn Gunning and 16-year-old Crystal Ann Knott would last be seen at the West Edmonton Mall. The reports say that the girls ended up telling some friends that they were going to hitchhike either to Dawson Creek or Fort St. John, BC, which, keep in mind, is where Joseph Labuchin is from, and also where Renee ended up growing up. So, could she have known Joseph Labuchin then? I think there's a high possibility. We don't really know much about Joseph, so who knows if he was even in town at that time, but it's really weird, all of these connections. The skulls of both teens would end up being found on May 21st of 2011 by campers near Grand Prairie, Alberta, which, keep in mind, is halfway between Edmonton and Fort St. John. Neither girl was known to be involved with drugs or the sex trade. However, they did hang around the West Edmonton Mall. So could these girls, much like Amber Tucaro, have been looking to hitchhike from the mall and ended up running into someone like possibly Joseph Labuchin or Michael Williams or Michael Briscoe? I think it's definitely a possibility. What I do know, however, is that 13-year-old Nina did not deserve what happened to her, and no sentence would ever have been enough to justify that for what they did to her. And the fact that this group of teens and an adult man decided to kidnap, essay, and murder a 13-year-old girl, it's absolutely sick, and it's scary. It's scary to think that there's people out in this world that are like that. But what I am glad is that in this case, they were caught, unlike the dozens of other unsolved disappearances and murders around Edmonton. But what I want to know is how you all feel about this case. I'm shocked after researching this case that there's not more people that have covered it, that there's not more people that have talked about it. It also seems like quite a few of them were on drugs when they committed this crime, meth being one of the main substances, and meth is something you don't mess with. It's no joke. And I also want to know how you feel about each of the sentencing that each of these individuals got. As I said, in Canada, they're all about reforming people, and in my opinion, some of these people didn't get sentenced harsh enough. I also feel like it's a little weird that everyone else's names have been put out to the public except for Buffy's. Her name to this day has never been released. It was concealed by her nickname. I mean, she was a minor at the time, but so were other people that were involved here, but their names were released. And she also was very actively involved in the murder, but her identity has been concealed and she's allowed to just be out there living her life. I also can't imagine the trauma that 15-year-old KB experienced, seeing her friend be attacked in front of her and then to be taken away from it and held hostage essentially. I just can't imagine the trauma that she experienced from that as well. This entire situation is just so messed up on so many different levels. But let's all have a chat about it below. Let me know if you want me to do some more deep dives like this. This is definitely a case that I'm glad I looked into and covered because there were so many levels to it that I didn't even realize I would get into. With that, if you have any other cases that you want me to cover as well, let me know down below and I will look into them. And as always, I hope you all stay safe out there, lock your windows and doors, and I will see you in the next video.